I'm going to show you how to perform authentication. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. Start now by subscribing and click the bell so that you don't miss a thing.
This video is part 8 in a 10-part video series in which we're discussing how to make REST API calls. In this video, we're going to be talking about performing authentication. In videos 1 through 7, we've been discussing many of the simpler concepts to understand in working with REST server APIs. Now, in this video, we turn our attention to the dreaded topic of authentication. Don't worry, hang in there. You got this. Postman supports numerous types of authentication. Now, when you first see this list of authentication types, you, like me, might be feeling immediately overwhelmed. Oh my gosh, how am I going to learn all these different types of authentication? The reality is you do not need to know every single type of authentication. In fact, we've made it through the first 7 videos knowing none of these. Well, actually, technically we're using no auth, but we didn't do anything with API keys or bearer tokens or OAuth 2 or any of these, because much of what you need to know to use REST servers in the beginning doesn't involve authentication. But at some point, you are going to encounter a REST server that does require authentication of some sort or another. That REST server might be using API keys, it might be using bearer tokens, might be using OAuth 2, could be using any of these. But the good news here is Postman is going to make it easy for us to work with each of these. Now, again, I want to emphasize you don't need to know every single one of these types of authentication. For example, NTLM, I've never used NTLM authentication in any project that I've been involved in, and I doubt I ever will. NTLM was introduced back in the 1990s. If I haven't needed to know how to use NTLM authentication by now, I'm never going to need to. So I've crossed that one off my list entirely. So again, my suggestion here is that you learn these different forms of authentication as you encounter projects where you need to know how to use them. Now I'm going to talk about several of these to give you a feel for how these different types of authentication work and how you set them up in Postman, or for that matter, when you're using curl or other programming languages. So we'll talk about some of these, but again, I'm going to leave it to you as an exercise in your spare time to learn about other authentication mechanisms as you see necessary. So let's start taking a look at these different types of authentication. I love it when I discover the REST server that I'm working with uses no authentication. No auth is the simplest out of all these types of authentication. When we use no auth, what we're saying is the server doesn't require authentication, and therefore we're not going to have the client do authentication. No auth is simple. In fact, you know how simple it is because in all the preceding 7 videos and all the examples that we've been working on, none of those REST servers required authentication. I intentionally chose those REST server APIs because they don't require authentication. So again, no auth is easy to use. Let's say no more about it. Instead, let's talk about the other types of authentication. When I first started working with REST servers, basic authentication was the first type of authentication I needed to learn about. As its name suggests, basic authentication is pretty straightforward. When you use basic authentication, what's going to happen is the client is going to send the server the user's username and password Base64 encoded. Now, if you don't know what Base64 encoded means, don't worry, I'll show you what that means in a moment. But basic authentication simply involves sending the username and the password in this special Base64 way. In Postman, it's very simple to use basic authentication. You simply set up your request, go to the authorization tab, set the type to basic authentication, and then you simply type in your username and password. Now, in some situations, like we saw in an earlier video, it may not be a username specifically or a password. It could be something else, but there will be something like a username and a password. All you need to do in Postman is simply enter that username and that password. Postman takes the information that you provide on the authorization tab and it creates for you a header called authorization. It sets the value of the authorization header to the word basic, followed by a space, followed by your credentials, Base64 encoded. But again, what do we mean by Base64 encoded? Well, as you can see here, you can go to someplace like Wikipedia or other places to find out exactly what we mean by Base64 encoding. So let's study this here. Okay, got it? The basic idea behind Base64 encoding is it's going to enable us to take some information and convert it into a purely text format. Let me show you an example. You can either do the following by writing a program from scratch, or I'm just going to go to a website online here that will take a string that I enter. It could be a string, it could be binary, it could be an image, but it's going to take whatever I enter and it's going to Base64 encode it. Let's Base64 encode something. We'll take the username administrator at vsphere.local and the password capital VM WARE 1 exclamation point. Now I'm actually going to get rid of that space and replace it with a colon, because when you Base64 encode your credentials, that's what these are, when doing basic authentication, this is what it needs to look like. You're taking your username, followed by a colon, followed by your password, and you're Base64 encoding them. I'm going to do that by clicking encode, and as you can see down here, this is those credentials Base64 encoded. Now, why don't we just memorize a few of the characters here in the encoding. So the encoding begins capital Y, capital W, capital R, lowercase t. Just sort of file those away in the back of your brain here. We're going to see this entire string come back in just a moment. So this is our credentials Base64 encoded. Let's see what Postman does with this. So when you go to the authorization tab and you enter your username and password, the header that gets set up is called authorization. Its value is set to the word basic, followed by a space, followed by your Base64 encoded credentials. Again, I asked you a moment ago to memorize the letters capital Y, capital W, capital R, T, blah, blah, blah. So there are our Base64 encoded credentials. Again, that's our username, followed by a colon, followed by our password, Base64 encoded. And that's all it takes in Postman to use basic authentication. Now, when using Postman, this is really straightforward and simple. On the other hand, if you're using other tools such as the curl utility, it has an option that will do Base64 encoding. Or if you use PowerShell, it has a command option that allows you to do Base64 encoding. So whatever language or whatever tool you're working with will presumably include some way of doing the actual mechanics of Base64 encoding your credentials. So even in the hardest of all to use programming languages, setting up your basic authentication is generally pretty straightforward.
If you're interested in VMware certification fast tracks, then check out the URL in the YouTube description for information on all of our current promos.
Another type of authentication that you'll see with many REST servers is called bearer token authentication. In the case of bearer token authentication, the user is given a token. For example, here is a bearer token. Now, in order to get that token, the user or somebody needs to go to the REST server to request the generation of a bearer token. So you go to the server, you generate a token, you give that token to a user. It's called a bearer token because whichever user happens to have, or the person who bears that token, can get into the REST server with all of the privileges that the token grants. So you don't want to give away your bearer token willy-nilly to somebody else, because whoever has the token is going to be able to get into the REST server. So think of the bearer token as sort of a secret little piece of information that the user uses to say, hey, it's me, let me in. In Postman, when you want to use bearer tokens, it's similar to basic authentication. Like basic authentication, you're going to go to the authorization tab, you're going to set the type to bearer, and then you're simply going to paste in the token that was generated for you by the REST server. Postman will take that information, and once again, it will create a header called authorization. It will set the value of the authorization header to bearer, followed by a space, followed by the token that you specified back on the authorization tab. Now, unlike basic authorization and its Base64 encoded credentials, here, Postman doesn't have to do anything to generate this string. This string, this bearer token, is generated by the REST server, not by Postman. So that's all it takes to set up bearer token authentication within Postman. You will, however, want to read through your REST server API documentation, because they will explain to you how you use their interface to generate the actual bearer token. API key authentication is yet another type of authentication. To use this one, in Postman, again, you'll go to the authorization tab. This time you'll choose type API key, and this time you're going to feed in slightly different information. It's kind of the same thing as basic authentication or bearer authentication, but the interface, as you can see, looks different. With API key authentication, the REST server, once again, is responsible for generating the key. So let's assume you've read your API documentation, you've gone to your REST server, and you requested an API key for the user that we're using here. So you take that API key, you go into Postman, go to authorization, set the type to API key, and then you are going to paste in the key that was generated for you, but you're also going to specify the name of the key. Now, in the case of this particular example, our key is called ID. So you type in ID and you paste in the API key that you got from the REST server. Then with API key authentication, you can choose how you want the client to pass in that API key. You can either pass in that API key via a query parameter. Remember, query parameters show up in your REST URLs at the tail end. Remember, they begin with question mark. For example, question mark ID equals your API key. So you can pass in your API key either using a query parameter, or you can pass it in like we did with basic authentication and bearer token authentication. You can pass in API keys via a header. So let's see what that would look like. So assuming you've gone to the authorization tab and supplied this information, here's what Postman's going to do. Once again, Postman is going to create a header, but this time the header isn't called authorization. Instead, the header is called whatever you said the key is called. On the previous slide, we said the key is called ID. Therefore, the header is called ID, and its value is whatever the API key is that you pasted in on the previous slide. If you go back through the last few slides in this video, you'll notice in some of the instances we were hard coding our keys or our tokens. In this case here, you can see us using a variable instead of clear text. Now, in general, that's what you want to do. In general, you want to put whatever key or whatever token into a variable, and you want to set the variable type to secret so that nobody can actually see what it is that you're typing. You don't want somebody to see your key. You don't want them to see your token. So using variables is very useful. Again, in the first few examples, we use clear text so that you could see what was going on. But in general practice, you want to use variables instead. All right, so we've talked about no auth. We've talked about basic authentication, bearer token authentication, and API key authentication. You can learn about the other types of authentication as you need to. But there's one more thing that I want to make certain that you're aware of. And in this instance, I think it's best to learn about it with some actual hands-on practice. So let's go head out to the lab environment. In all the authorization examples I've shown you so far, we've set up the authorization on the individual requests. So let's take a look at that. Here's a request called Get All Workflows. We've seen it in previous videos. So we're looking at Get All Workflows, and the way authorization is working for this particular REST request is we have a header called CSP auth token, and its value is our token. This is an example of using API key authentication. Now, to set this up, we would have gone to a authorization tab, and we would have set the authorization type to API key authentication. But let's actually see how this is set up. If we go to authorization, it doesn't say the type is API key. Instead, it says we're going to inherit the authorization settings from our parent. We could have said API key here on this actual request. So we could say API key, we could then say CSP-auth-token, and then we could pass in our token, but we didn't do it that way. Furthermore, we could have had the choice here of saying header is the way we're going to pass this info in, or query parameters, but again, we didn't do it this way. We did not explicitly put the token into the request. We did not explicitly say the name of the API key is CSP-auth-token. Instead, what we said is we're not going to specify the authentication settings here in this request. Instead, we're going to inherit the authentication settings, the authorization settings from this request's parent. So who is this request's parent? Well, looking over on the left side of the screen here, here's our request, and its parent is workflows. Let's go open up this folder called workflows. Folders also have an authorization tab. And on that authorization tab, you can say, for all the requests in this folder, here is how we want to do authentication. So if I wanted to set up authentication for both this request and this request so that they use API key, I could set API key as the authorization type on the folder. And similarly, we can say that the folder's authorization isn't going to be set explicitly here, but instead we want its parent to specify how authorization is going to occur. So the parent of these requests is workflows, but what's the parent of workflows? Well, the answer to that is the collection. If you go up to the collection, you can see that the collection also has an authorization tab, and here we could choose from any of our different authorization types. In this specific example, we chose API key, and it's here that we've plugged in the authorization information. And since we've set it at the collection level, any of these folders and or REST requests that have been set to inherit will receive these authorization settings. So another reason why you create collections and folders is because doing so allows you to set up authorization at those levels so that you can propagate your authorization settings down to eventually to the requests themselves. All right, so there you have it. You now know the basics that you need to know to perform various different types of authentication. Again, there was a URL from the fine folks at Postman on one of the very first slides in this video, so I'd encourage you to go back if you want to learn about all the different types of authentication. But again, you've now mastered what you need to know to get you rolling with lots of different types of REST servers. So let's go out there into the real world and start putting this authentication, authorization information into practice. Please join me in the next video where we'll talk about REST and vRealize automation.